Hi folks, Daniel here, and I've got another how-to, but this time it's not a Cadillac how-to. Today we're working on Vincent's Miata MX-5. It's a 2019. You probably saw it in my autocross versus V-Sport video. Well, today he's doing a ton of mods so that his car will be competitive in STR class. And we're not gonna cover all those mods today, but we are gonna do the header install. He's installing the JDL header. It's a 4-in-1 header for the car, and guess what? It makes
more power!
A whole
10 horses!
Yeah, well, believe me, that's actually quite a bit. You know, this car only weighs like it only weighs 2,300 pounds, but it makes 180 horsepower, so 181. If you look at it, 10 horsepower is like 5%. If I were to do 5% on my car, that would be like 25 horsepower. So I think it's a worthy mod to do. Plus, you know, other mods down the road, it all comes together. Every little bit helps, right? So we're gonna go over this quick and easy install, hopefully. I mean, I've done header installs in the past, and like on V6s and V8s typically, right, you got 2 headers to work with. There's only 1 here, and there's a lot of space in the engine bay, so it shouldn't be too bad, but with every header install, it seems like there's always a busted knuckle or a scratched piece of car or, you know, some curse words. I'm hoping that we don't get any of that today. It looks pretty easy, but you never know. We'll just take it easy and ease it out of the tight space. All right, so let's get to it. The JDL header is a much smoother design. It's much more efficient with its mandrel bends, TIG welds, 1.75-inch primary tubes that are port matched, equal length tubing, and no pre-cat. It starts at $799, and you have the option of many different thermal coatings for extra price. Not only will you gain a few horsepower, but it definitely looks better in the engine bay. And the best part is it does come with a lifetime warranty to the original buyer. Now, if you'd like to jump directly to a certain part of the video, I've provided time links in the description below. Just click on that time and it'll jump right to that part of the video. Otherwise, stay tuned for the entire install. Here's your quick overview of the install. First, remove your strut tower brace with its 6 nuts holding it on. Next, we'll unclip and unbolt some heater hoses, and this will give us a little more room to work. We're going to remove the heat shield with these 3 14mm bolts. Then we're going to remove the 5 nuts holding the stock manifold in place. Then we're going to remove this nut on the engine mount. Remove the skid plate underneath the car. Remove the nuts on the stock manifold to mid-pipe. Remove this bracket holding the manifold to the engine. Then we're going to jack up the engine a little bit to make some room, disconnect the O2 sensor, and pull out the stock manifold. We'll drop in the new header, tighten all the bolts to the proper torque spec, then install the gasket at the mid-pipe. We'll tighten 2 bolts there to the proper spec, put the nut back on the engine mount, route your O2 sensor, and put your skid plate back on. Don't forget to put this bolt back in and clip in this heater hose. Then put your strut tower brace back on, start your car, check for leaks, and now I'm going to tell you which tools are required. All right, I recommend the following tools. You'll need a large breaker bar, a torque wrench to set the right torque settings. This one's only $20 at Harbor Freight, but there is a reason that some torque wrenches are over $200. So choose wisely, but this should get you done in a pinch. Vince found this really cool tool. It's got flex heads on both ends. One's a 1/4 inch, one's a 3/8 inch drive, and it's long. Really good for getting into tight spaces and having leverage. You'll need ratchets, 18 inches worth of extensions, not shown here. Combination wrenches. You definitely want a 14mm. The ratcheting kind is very helpful. A 12mm and 10mm could be useful. You'll also want a 5/8 inch. If you don't have a 5/8 inch, a 5/8 inch socket will be fine as well. Also, if you don't have a certain size, maybe even adjustable wrench will work in a pinch. You'll want anti-seize for the O2 sensor. You'll also want one of these O2 sensor crow's foot tools. It's a 7/8 or 22mm size, very useful. A flathead screwdriver, gloves, and the following sockets. You'll need a flex joint, a deep 10mm, 12mm, 14mm, deep 14, and a 1/2 inch drive 14mm to do the braking with the breaker bar. As I mentioned, a 5/8, a 5/16 socket, and there's one really difficult nut on the header, and I think this tool would have been really useful. It's a 14mm offset, but we did get it done with just a regular combination wrench, but maybe give that a shot. You'll be under the car, so you'll need to jack up the car, have a jack and jack stands, and a light to see under there. Also some zip ties. Plastic ones could get brittle and break, so I do suggest getting some metal ones. That'll be helpful so the zip ties don't break down the road. Lastly, you will need a piece of wood, maybe like 1 inch thick, 15 by 9 inches or so, as a support for your oil pan as you raise the engine to do this job. Of course, if you have power tools, feel free to use those. All right, that's it for the tools required. Now let's get to the detailed install. First, remove the strut tower brace. There are 6 14mm nuts holding them on. You really only need to move the passenger side away, but we ended up just taking off the whole thing. Vincent does a good job of organizing his parts on cardboard and noting where they came from and which nuts and bolts go to what. Next, you'll need to unclip this heater hose. It's just a little plastic clip with a couple sets of teeth. Use a flathead screwdriver and you'll be able to get it off. Next, there's a hard coolant line bolted to the fender. It has a 10mm bolt. Go ahead and remove that and it'll help this hard line move a little bit out of the way later when you need the space. There is one more bolt underneath the windshield washer bottle you can undo, but we didn't and it was fine. Next, you need to remove the heat shield off the stock manifold. This is what the bolts look like because they're a little harder to see in the engine bay. The top two are pretty easy to get to, but the third one is a little harder to get to. We used a boxed in wrench, preferably one with a ratchet, makes things a little easier. We also hadn't moved these coolant lines yet, so it was a little tighter. Here's the stock manifold and the 5 nuts that need to be removed. These are 14mm nuts. Now, depending on how old your car is and what kind of moisture it's been seeing, these could be pretty tightly on or rusted on. If that's the case, a few days before the procedure, go ahead and occasionally spray some penetrant lubricant on there to help break away some of that rust. And then, of course, just before you start the procedure, this may help. Now, if a nut does come off, but it also brings the stud with it, you'll need to fix that situation. And there are plenty of other videos on YouTube that can describe that situation because it does happen. But it's 2019 and your new Mazda shouldn't have this problem quite yet.
Swivel head to the rescue.
Most of these bolts are pretty easy to get to, but yeah, Vincent found that having a swivel on that last one closest to the firewall made it a little easier. All right, once you have all 5 nuts off, you can see that the manifold is loose. Now we need to loosen the engine mount nut. We built this setup with a 6-inch and a 12-inch extension on a ratchet, and it's a 14mm nut, of course. It's a little tight, but you should be able to get it with a regular ratchet. All right, because I'm apparently the small person, I get to do this. What are we gonna use here? This thing? Next, we're gonna use a 12mm socket to remove the 9 bolts holding on the skid plate. With all those bolts, it sure is nice to have power tools.
Power!
Yeah, real power.
It seemed whoever did the oil change on Vince's car last really torqued these down. I don't think they need to be that tight though. Here's the plate and all of its bolts with Vince's expert organization. Now we need to disconnect the mid-pipe from the stock manifold. It's right under here, and there'll be 2 14mm nuts holding it on. They're already removed in this picture. Again, it was helpful to use power tools because these were torqued on pretty good, but they came off pretty easy. So we ended up getting this nut off, but over here, the whole stud came out. Now that's not really a big deal, as when you put your stock manifold back on someday, you can just put the stud in and the nut was really locked onto the stud. Next, you want to remove this bracket that holds the manifold to the engine. There are 4, you guessed it, 14mm bolts again. Now we'll need to slightly raise the engine, but we didn't have any wood handy. So we're on the search for a piece of wood to put under the oil pan because we need to support it and not damage the oil pan. So, you know, this is what we do. We dig around and basements trying to find scrap pieces of wood, and Vince doesn't have any.
Alright, we're going to Home Depot to get some wood. Gotta get some wood at Home Depot.
Once we got our wood home, we cut it to size. We found about 15 by 9 inches was good. All right, back under the car, and Vince is gonna pump the jack up while I align the piece of wood just under the oil pan, the black part there. This is to ensure that we don't smash the oil pan or dent it in any way. You definitely don't wanna do that, or you could have some serious issues. Now the engine is up a couple inches, you can kind of decide if it's enough, and if not, just pump it up a little bit higher. As we tried to get the stock manifold out, it was a tight squeeze. You can see that it was contacting the transmission bell housing as well as the frame. We had not removed that bracket yet, so it was a little tighter for us, and that's why I told you to do it earlier.
I think we're good up here. I think what I need you to do is come back and hold this stuff. Basically, I can't get it past because this is just hitting the header. But if this wasn't here, I think it'd come right out.
So what is getting in the way for Vince is this little metal tab by this plastic clip that we unclipped earlier. It will also scratch your new header, so we do suggest wrapping it up some way or taping it off to minimize scratching to your new header. Now as we looked closer, we saw that there's a bolt here.
Oh!
We might get a little play out of it, and that's why I told you to unbolt that hard line earlier, and it will give you the space you need to pull out the stock manifold.
Can you pull up on the header?
A second set of hands to help flex those coolant lines is pretty helpful.
Oh wait, we gotta release the
O2 sensor.
Yeah.
Fruit.
All right, now that the manifold is just slightly out of the way, you can actually reach this O2 sensor clip. There's a clip holding the wire in place there. So you'll just use a flat head to get that. And then just under the water pump here is where the other end of the clip is. There's a nice little spring clip button thing there. You can press that and it will release the O2 sensor. And now the manifold just glides on out. Here's all the parts you should have, plus the bracket that we didn't remove at the time. Now, I do recommend that you would inspect your header as soon as it arrives at your doorstep. We are just getting to it now, and we unfortunately found that the exhaust manifold flange is not in great condition. It has scratches, a weird discoloration, as well as really bad port matching. Vince called up JDL and they were not happy. They said that is not our kind of quality, and so they sent out a new header and gaskets right away. Here you can see the new one is in much better condition. Just look at this comparison. Now that the two manifolds are side by side, you can really see the difference. But it's time to remove the O2 sensor from the stock manifold. It's a 22mm, and you can either just use a large wrench or get a O2 sensor crow's foot from the auto parts store. It may be on there pretty tight depending on the type of conditions that your car's been in, but you don't want to strip this. If you do, you'll probably just end up having to buy a whole new O2 sensor, and they aren't cheap. You have the option of moving it directly to the new header, but it could get in the way a little bit installing it. You can see once it's installed, it's actually pretty accessible, so I recommend waiting until it's installed. Before you install it, put a little anti-seize on the threads, but don't get it on the sensor itself. On our first install, Vincent installed it before we installed the header into the car, but on the second header install, we did it after the install. So you just screw in the O2 sensor, and then we used a crow's foot. It just slides right over the top. It's a really convenient tool, and then you can put your ratchet or torque wrench on it. But it's really important that if you're going to use your torque wrench, that the torque wrench is aligned with the little leg sticking off of the crow's foot. That'll give you the accurate torque reading. Now we can drop in the new header. Again, it helps to have somebody pull the coolant lines out of the way, and the new header slides in much easier without that pre-catalytic converter. I'm not saying it's a breeze, but we did get it in about 2 minutes. It just takes a little bit of fiddling and finding just the right angle to where it slides on in.
We're going under.
Here on our first time header install, I went underneath to see if I could help guide it in. Again, we hadn't removed that darn bracket, and that was a little bit in the way. But if you look closely, it is a tight fit between the transmission bell housing and the engine mount there. So jack up the car as needed to maybe make a little more room there. So we fiddled with it a little more and then of course realized we definitely need to get rid of that bracket. It's not needed anyway with the new header, so we did that and it was a little easier to get in. Once the header is in place and neatly over the studs, you'll need to put on the 14mm nuts. You can use your fingers of course to get them mostly on, use a ratchet to get them just a little further, but don't tighten them down yet. There's actually a very important order that you want to tighten down these nuts, and it goes in 2 stages. So first we'll tighten down the middle, and then the one to the left of that, and then the one to the right of the middle, and then the one on the far left, and then one on the far right. We'll bring them to 25 foot-pounds, and then we'll do the same order again to 37 foot-pounds. Now that center nut is very challenging. You're only going to be able to get a boxed in wrench somewhat underneath and then maybe from the top as well, but it's pretty hard with a short wrench like that to get in 37 foot-pounds of torque, so just do your best. But every time you torque the first round, all the others are going to kind of loosen up a little bit as the metal flange sort of flattens out. So don't forget that. You definitely need to go back and re-torque everything to that full 37 foot-pounds. The center one, the best you can. Next, go ahead and put that engine mount nut back on and torque it down.
All right, next up we're going to be installing the mid-pipe to header gasket. So going into the car.
Now there's a new gasket that comes with the JDL header. It's this 2-bolt flange gasket. We use the smooth side against the header and the slightly more rounded side against the mid-pipe. You'll use the provided hardware to put it in there. It's a bolt with a washer on the header side, so 2 of those. And then on the mid-pipe side, you're going to use a washer, lock nut, and then a nut on top of that. Tighten them down with your fingers, then use a ratchet to get them snug, and then use your torque wrench alternately on each bolt to slowly get them up to 25 foot-pounds. This will create a nice even seal. Next, we'll use the provided O2 extension harness to extend the O2's cable all the way up to the engine. Use the female end and plug it into the O2 sensor.
Oh, man. That is the noise of success on that end, at least.
Then you can route the wire down under the header along the engine block over to the female plug that's under the water pump. Also, clip the wire into the yellow clip, and then I'm going to show you what to do with the excess. Initially, this is what it looks like. See the gray clip? It's really close to the header, and the header will melt that clip. And I've been through this. A melted O2 sensor wire is not fun. It will make your engine run terrible, and you'll be pretty confused until you figure out what's going on. So take the O2 sensor wire extension, and what I chose to do is route it as close to the engine and the transmission as I could. Then it has enough clearance from the hot header, which is much hotter than the engine. Then we used a couple zip ties, actually metal ones would be even better, to zip tie the cable to the engine mount. And then we took the excess and bunched it up and zip tied it together up here over the engine mount. All right, now you've done that, you can put the skid plate back on the car. Start all 9 bolts with your hand, and then when you're sure they're not cross-threaded, go ahead and zing them in with your power tool if you got it. All right, we're almost there. Now let's put that bolt back in to secure the hard coolant line against the fender. Then clip in the soft coolant line again. And now you can put your strut tower braces back on with those 6 nuts. You've cleaned up your engine bay and made sure everything is secure. You can go ahead and start it up and check for leaks. Unfortunately, we did have a leak, but when we installed the new header, we found out where it was. It was at the mid-pipe. You can see evidence here on the header where the exhaust soot is, also on the mid-pipe gasket. Now this may have been due to a bad gasket or just the install itself, but with the new header setup, the whole exhaust system is much more rigid, and this gasket can kind of take the brunt of force. So until a mid-pipe comes out with a good flex, you may be going through these gaskets often. Alright, if your install is complete and you're happy with it, it's time to take out your car for a drive. Alright folks, that's it for the Mazda Miata header install. As you can see, it's not too bad. All the steps are pretty simple and a couple of little tight spaces, so you just want to have the right tools as always. I would say the hardest part though is maneuvering the header in there. That's typical for a header install. Now it is a bit noisier now, so Vincent's probably going to get a mid-pipe muffler to help quiet it down. I mean, it currently is also his daily driver, and he doesn't really want a car that loud, but I understand. Plus, it will exceed certain decibel levels that wouldn't be legal for, well, sometimes on the street, but also for some racetrack events. So, alright, that's it, but thanks for watching another how-to here on the Jet Fuel Only channel. I hope to be bringing you more how-tos on different cars in the future. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications so you'll know when the next video comes out. See ya.